Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we are going back. Further back than we have ever been. The year is 2560 before Christ, more than 2,000 years before Julius Caesar will be born, more than 2,000 years before the first emperor of China will unify his world, more than 3,000 years before Constantine will see a sign in the sky, more than 3,500 years before the Vikings will beach their long ships on the coast of England. We are further back tonight than we have ever been. The world in this year is unrecognizable. There are no empires in Europe. There are no cities in Britain. The land that will one day be called Greece is inhabited by scattered farming communities who have not yet invented the alphabet. Rome will not exist for 2,000 years. The peoples of northern Europe live in small villages of wood and thatch, leaving no written records, building nothing that will survive. But in one narrow strip of land, along one great river, in the northeast corner of Africa, something extraordinary is happening. A civilization, one of the oldest in human history, has been growing for 1,000 years. It has cities, it has writing, it has mathematics, it has a government, a religion, a system of law, a calendar, a medicine, an art that will endure for 3,000 years. It has, most astonishingly, the technology and the social organization to move millions of tons of stone across a desert and stack them with extraordinary precision into the largest structures the world will see for nearly 4,000 years. Settle in. This is their story. To understand the pyramids, we must first understand the river. Egypt, as the ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote, is the gift of the Nile. The Nile is the longest river in the world, more than 4,000 miles, from its sources in the highlands of East Africa to its delta on the Mediterranean coast. It flows through desert. For most of its length in Egypt, the land on either side of the river is barren. Sand, rock, dust, heat, nothing grows, nothing lives. The Sahara to the west and the eastern desert toward the Red Sea are among the most inhospitable landscapes on earth. But along the river itself, for a narrow strip, sometimes a few hundred yards wide, sometimes a few miles, the land is green. The Nile every year floods. The floodwaters rise in the late summer, driven by monsoon rains thousands of miles to the south in the Ethiopian highlands. The waters spread across the valley floor. They deposit on the land a layer of rich black silt, the fertile mud that has been carried for thousands of miles from the mountains of Central Africa. When the waters recede in the autumn, the farmers plant their crops in the black earth. The wheat grows, the barley grows, the flax grows, the papyrus grows in the marshes, the cattle graze on the green strips, the fish are plentiful in the river, the birds are plentiful in the reeds. This narrow strip of green running through a vast desert is Egypt. It is, in a sense, the most artificial of all ancient civilizations. A civilization that exists only because of a single river, and that would cease to exist if the river stopped flowing. The Egyptians knew this. They worshipped the Nile. They called the flood the gift of the gods. They organized their entire calendar around it. 3 seasons: the flooding, the planting, and the harvest. Their agriculture, their religion, their government, their art, all of it was shaped by the rhythm of the river. And it was the river, ultimately, that made the pyramids possible. The Nile gave Egypt surplus. A farmer on the Nile could produce more food than he needed to survive. That surplus could be collected as taxes by the state. The state could use that surplus to feed workers who did not farm, who built instead. Stonecutters, haulers, masons, scribes, overseers, priests. Without the Nile, there would have been no surplus. Without the surplus, there would have been no state. Without the state, there would have been no pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza is, in the deepest sense, a monument built from black mud and flood water, shaped by the labor of men who were fed by a river that had been flowing in the same course for millions of years before they were born. The period of Egyptian history in which the Great Pyramids were built is called the Old Kingdom. It lasted roughly from 2600 to 2100 before Christ, about 500 years. It is sometimes called the Age of the Pyramids, for the obvious reason that nearly all of Egypt's Great Pyramids were built during this period. The Old Kingdom was ruled by pharaohs. The pharaoh was not merely a king. He was, in the Egyptian understanding, a god. A living God, walking the earth, mediating between the human world and the divine world. He was the son of Ra, the sun god. He was the incarnation of Horus, the falcon god. He was, in his person, the guarantor of cosmic order, a concept the Egyptians called Ma'at, which meant something like truth, justice, balance, and harmony, all at once. If the pharaoh ruled well, if he maintained Ma'at, then the Nile would flood on time, the crops would grow, the enemies of Egypt would be defeated, and the cosmic order would be preserved. If the pharaoh failed, if Ma'at was disrupted, then the river might fail, the crops might wither, and chaos might return to the world. This belief gave the pharaoh extraordinary power. He owned, in theory, all the land of Egypt. He commanded all the labor. He controlled the granaries, the treasury, the army, the priesthood. He was the state in a way that no Roman emperor or Chinese emperor would ever quite be. The Roman emperor was a man who had been given power by the Senate or the army. The pharaoh was a god who had been given a body by the heavens. When the pharaoh died, his divinity did not end. He passed from the world of the living to the world of the dead, the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. There he would join Osiris, the god of the dead, and rule in the afterlife as he had ruled in life. His body, preserved through mummification, would serve as his vessel in the next world. His tomb, stocked with food, furniture, tools, servants, and treasure, would serve as his palace. The tomb, therefore, was not merely a burial place. It was the pharaoh's eternal home. It was the most important building he would ever commission. It had to be vast. It had to be permanent. It had to last forever. For the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, the answer was the pyramid. Before we reach the pyramids themselves, it is worth pausing to imagine what life was like in the land that built them. Egypt, in the time of the Old Kingdom, was a country of perhaps 1 to 2 million people. Most of them were farmers. They lived in small villages along the Nile, clusters of mud brick houses, low and flat-roofed, arranged along the narrow canals that distributed the floodwater to the fields. The houses were simple, a few rooms, straw mats on the floor, a hearth for cooking, a flat roof where the family slept in the warm months under the stars. The farmer's day was shaped by the river. In the flood season, when the fields were under water, there was little to do. This was the season when the pharaoh called up his laborers, the men who would be sent to the quarries, to the building sites, to the great works of the state. In the planting season, the farmer worked his land, plowing with a wooden plow pulled by oxen, sowing barley and wheat by hand, irrigating the fields through a network of small canals. In the harvest season, the grain was cut, bundled, and threshed. A portion went to the state as tax. The rest fed the family. The Egyptians ate bread and drank beer, the two staples of the Egyptian diet, made from the same grain, processed differently. They ate onions, garlic, lentils, and lettuce. They ate fish from the river and fowl from the marshes. Meat, beef, pork, goat was for the wealthy and for feast days. They sweetened their food with honey and dates. They wore linen, woven from the flax that grew in the Nile Valley. The cloth was white, light, and cool in the desert heat. The wealthy wore fine linen, almost transparent. The poor wore coarser cloth. Children in the paintings are often shown naked. They wrote, not all of them, but the scribes among them, in hieroglyphs, the sacred picture writing of Egypt. A scribe was a man of importance. He could read the records of the granaries. He could calculate the taxes. He could draft the letters of the pharaoh. The scribe in the Egyptian social order stood above the farmer, the craftsman, and the soldier. Be a scribe, an ancient Egyptian text advises a young man. Your limbs will be sleek, your hands will be soft. You will go forth in white garments. This was the civilization, practical, organized, riverine, deeply religious, that built the pyramids. Not a civilization of mystery, as later ages would imagine. A civilization of bread and beer and linen and mud, organized by scribes, commanded by a god-king, and sustained by the annual miracle of the Nile flood. Before the pyramids, the pharaohs of Egypt were buried in structures called mastabas. A mastaba was, in essence, a rectangular box of mud brick, built over an underground burial chamber. The body of the pharaoh was placed in the chamber, along with his grave goods, food, wine, furniture, jewelry, weapons, clothing, and sometimes the bodies of servants who had been killed to accompany him into the afterlife. The mastaba above ground was flat-roofed, solid and unremarkable. It looked from a distance like a large, low, rectangular mound. Mastabas worked. They protected the body. They stored the grave goods. They could be enlarged and decorated over time with false doors and offering chapels where the living could bring food and prayers for the dead pharaoh. But they were not impressive. They were not permanent. The mud brick crumbled. The sand drifted over them. Within a few generations, a mastaba could become invisible, just another low hill in the desert, indistinguishable from the landscape around it. For the pharaohs of the early dynasties, this was not good enough. A god's tomb should be visible. A god's tomb should be permanent. A god's tomb should announce to anyone who saw it, for as long as anyone could see, that a great ruler lay beneath. The solution came from a man who was not a pharaoh at all. His name was Imhotep. He was, by all accounts, one of the most remarkable men of the ancient world. He served as vizier, chief minister, to the pharaoh Djoser, who ruled Egypt around 2670 years before Christ. But Imhotep was more than a politician. He was an architect. He was a physician. He was a priest. He was, in later centuries, worshipped as a god, the only non-royal Egyptian to be fully deified after death. The Greeks, when they encountered his legend, identified him with Asclepius, their own god of medicine. Imhotep's great achievement was the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, a vast necropolis on the western bank of the Nile, south of the modern city of Cairo. Instead of building a single mastaba, Imhotep stacked 6 mastabas on top of each other, each one smaller than the one below, creating a stepped structure that rose in 6 great stages to a height of over 200 feet. And he built it in stone. This was the crucial innovation. Before Imhotep, Egyptian monumental architecture had been built in mud brick. Imhotep used limestone, quarried from the cliffs near Saqqara, cut into blocks, dressed smooth, and fitted together with extraordinary precision. The stone would last. The stone would not crumble. The step pyramid of Djoser still stands today. It is the oldest stone structure of its scale in the world. Imhotep had created a new form. The pharaohs who followed would spend the next century refining it. Sneferu was the founder of the 4th dynasty, the dynasty that would produce the 3 Great Pyramids of Giza. He ruled for perhaps 24 years, from around 2613 to 2589 before Christ. He was, by the standards of the Egyptian sources, a popular king, remembered as generous, approachable, and good-humored. He was also the most prolific pyramid builder in Egyptian history. He built, or attempted, at least 3 pyramids, more than any other pharaoh. And in building them, he solved, through trial and error, the engineering problems that had defeated his predecessors. His first attempt was at Meidum, south of Saqqara. He began with a step pyramid, 7 steps, then 8, and then tried to convert it into a true pyramid by filling in the steps and covering the whole structure with a smooth limestone casing. The conversion failed. The casing stones, improperly bonded to the steps beneath, eventually collapsed. Today, the Meidum Pyramid stands as a strange 3-stepped tower, surrounded by a vast apron of fallen stone, a monument to ambition that exceeded, temporarily, the available engineering skill. His second attempt was at Dashur, 15 miles south of Giza. This pyramid, known as the Bent Pyramid, is one of the most visually striking monuments in Egypt. It begins at a steep angle, about 54 degrees, then abruptly changes to a shallower angle, about 43 degrees, about halfway up. The result is a pyramid with a pronounced bend in its profile, as if the builders, partway through construction, realized that the original angle was too steep and the structure was in danger of collapse. They were probably right. The bent pyramid is cracked. The internal chambers show signs of structural stress. The builders, learning from their mistake, reduced the angle and completed the pyramid in a safer, if less elegant, form. Sneferu's 3rd pyramid, also at Dashur, was the breakthrough. It is called the Red Pyramid, for the reddish color of the exposed limestone blocks. It was built at the shallower angle of about 43 degrees from the start. It is a true pyramid, smooth-sided, geometrically precise, rising to a clean point at the top. It was the first successful true pyramid in history. The engineering problems were finally solved. When Sneferu died, his son inherited the throne, the treasury, the labor force, and the accumulated engineering knowledge of 3 pyramid projects. His son's name was Khufu, and Khufu intended to build something that would surpass everything his father had done. The lesson of Sneferu's reign is one of the great untold stories of the ancient world. A king who failed, and failed again, and then succeeded, not through divine inspiration, but through persistence, through observation, through the willingness to learn from catastrophe. The bent pyramid, with its awkward change of angle, is a monument to honest engineering, to builders who recognized a mistake in time and corrected it, rather than pushing forward into disaster. The red pyramid, smooth and perfect, is the reward for that honesty. Modern engineers visiting Dashur have noted that Sneferu's builders were, in effect, conducting experiments at the scale of mountains. They were testing the limits of stone, of gravity, of human organization. They were writing, in limestone, the textbook that their successors would follow. Khufu chose a site on the Giza plateau, a flat limestone shelf on the western bank of the Nile, about 8 miles south of the modern center of Cairo. The plateau was high enough above the floodplain to be safe from the annual inundation. It was close enough to the river for stone to be transported by barge. The underlying rock was solid, strong enough to support the immense weight of the structure Khufu had in mind. The project, from its inception, was on a scale that had never been attempted before. The base of the pyramid would cover 13 acres, an area large enough to contain 10 football fields. The sides would rise at an angle of about 51 degrees. The finished height would be 481 feet, nearly 500 feet, taller than a 40-story building. The structure would contain approximately 2.3 million blocks of stone, with an average weight of about 2.5 tons each. Some blocks, the granite beams above the burial chamber, would weigh more than 80 tons. The total weight of the finished pyramid would be approximately 6 million tons. The construction would take, the sources suggest, about 20 years. A workforce of perhaps 20,000 men would labor on the site during the flood season, the 3 or 4 months of the year when the Nile was high and farming was impossible, when the farmers of Egypt had nothing to do and could be conscripted or hired for royal building projects. 20,000 men, 20 years, 6 million tons of stone. The logistics were staggering. Feeding 20,000 men required enormous quantities of bread, beer, onions, garlic, and meat. Housing them required a temporary city, barracks, bakeries, breweries, workshops, hospitals. Organizing their labor required a bureaucracy of scribes, overseers, and engineers. Moving the stone required roads, ramps, sledges, rollers, levers, and an intimate knowledge of the properties of limestone and granite. The planning alone was a monumental task. Before the first stone was quarried, surveyors had to level the site. 13 acres of limestone plateau flattened to within an inch. They did this, most likely, by cutting shallow channels in the rock, filling them with water, and marking the waterline. Anywhere the rock stood above the waterline, it was chipped away. Anywhere it fell below, it was filled. The result was a platform so flat that modern laser surveys have confirmed its accuracy to within 2 centimeters across its entire surface. The orientation was equally precise. The pyramid's sides face almost exactly north, south, east, and west. The Egyptians, who had no compass, achieved this by observing the stars, probably by tracking the rising and setting of a circumpolar star and bisecting the angle to find true north. They did this 4,500 years ago. Their error was less than 1/12 of a degree. And all of this, every loaf of bread, every block of stone, every drop of beer, every star observed from the desert at night, was ultimately paid for by the black mud of the Nile. How exactly the Great Pyramid was built is one of the most debated questions in archaeology. We do not have a contemporary account. The Egyptians, frustratingly, left no written description of their construction methods. What we have are the buildings themselves, the physical evidence of how the stones were cut, moved, and placed, and the accounts of later writers, particularly the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 before Christ, more than 2,000 years after the pyramid was built. The quarrying was done locally for the most part. The bulk of the pyramid's limestone was quarried from a site just a few hundred yards south of the pyramid itself. You can still see the quarry today, a vast rectangular excavation in the plateau from which millions of tons of stone were extracted. The higher quality limestone used for the outer casing, the smooth white stone that once covered the entire pyramid, was quarried across the river at Tura and brought to the site by barge during the flood season. The granite for the internal chambers was brought from Aswan, 500 miles to the south, also by river. The blocks were moved on wooden sledges, pulled by teams of men over sand that had been wetted to reduce friction. A wall painting in the tomb of a later official shows exactly this method. A group of men pulling a sledge, with one man standing at the front, pouring water onto the sand ahead of the runners. The blocks were raised into position by ramps. The exact form of the ramps is debated. Some archaeologists believe a single long straight ramp was built, extending from the quarry to the pyramid, growing longer and higher as the pyramid rose. Others believe a spiral ramp wound around the outside of the pyramid. Others, more recently, have proposed an internal ramp, a ramp built inside the pyramid itself, spiraling upward through the structure, which would explain certain anomalies in the pyramid's internal architecture. We do not know which theory is correct. We may never know. The ramps, whatever their form, were dismantled when the pyramid was completed. The evidence is gone. What we do know is that the precision of the construction was extraordinary. The base of the pyramid is level to within less than an inch across its entire 13-acre footprint. The sides are aligned to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, with an error of less than 1/12 of a degree. The blocks are fitted so tightly that, in many places, a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. This level of precision, achieved with copper tools and human muscle over 20 years in a civilization that had no iron, no wheels, and no pulleys, remains one of the most impressive achievements in the history of engineering. For centuries, the popular imagination held that the pyramids were built by slaves. This idea was encouraged by Herodotus, who described the pyramid builders in terms that suggested forced labor. It was reinforced by the Hebrew Bible, which described the Israelites as slaves in Egypt. It was amplified by Hollywood, by images of whipped slaves hauling stone under a burning sun. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. The workers' village at Giza, excavated since the 1990s, reveals a community that was well organized, well fed, and, by the standards of the ancient world, well treated. The workers lived in long barracks, arranged in neat rows. They ate bread, beer, beef, and fish, a diet that was, for the period, excellent. They had access to medical care. Skeletons found in the workers' cemetery show healed bones, evidence that injured workers were treated and allowed to recover rather than being discarded. The workers were organized into teams called gangs with names, Friends of Khufu, Drunkards of Menkaura, that suggest a certain camaraderie, even pride. The gangs competed with each other. Graffiti found inside the pyramid, hidden marks left by the builders in places that were never meant to be seen, record the names of the gangs and, sometimes, boasts about their speed or skill. These were not slaves. They were skilled laborers, working for the pharaoh, fed from the royal granaries, housed in a purpose-built settlement, organized into professional teams. Some of them may have been conscripted, called up for royal service during the flood season when there was no farming to do. But conscription for royal projects was a normal part of Egyptian life, not a form of slavery. The small cemetery near the workers' village tells its own story. The workers were buried with simple grave goods, bread pots, beer jars, small figurines. Their graves were modest, but they were buried within sight of the pyramid they had helped to build. This was, by Egyptian standards, an honor. They would spend eternity in the shadow of the monument they had created. Some of the skeletons tell individual stories. One man had a broken arm that had been set and healed, evidence of medical care. Another had lost 2 fingers, probably in a construction accident, and had continued working afterward. Several showed signs of arthritis and spinal compression, the long-term cost of hauling stone. These were not men who had been worked to death. They were men who had worked hard, been fed well, been treated when injured, and been buried with respect when they died. The pyramid, in this light, was not a monument to cruelty. It was a monument to organization, to a society that could feed, house, and coordinate tens of thousands of people for a single purpose, decade after decade, without collapse. Whatever else the Old Kingdom pharaohs were, they were extraordinary managers. The interior of the Great Pyramid is, for most visitors, a disappointment. After the grandeur of the exterior, the sheer overwhelming mass of stone, the perfect geometry, the sweep of the desert horizon, the inside feels cramped, dark, and strangely empty. The passages are low and narrow. The air is warm and still. The stone walls are bare and undecorated. Unlike the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, built 1,000 years later, the Great Pyramid has no paintings, no inscriptions, no carved reliefs. The main entrance on the north face, about 55 feet above the ground, leads to a descending passage that slopes downward through the body of the pyramid and into the bedrock beneath. This passage leads to an unfinished subterranean chamber, a rough-hewn room carved from the living rock that was apparently abandoned during construction. The original plan, it seems, was to place the burial chamber underground. The plan was changed. From the descending passage, an ascending passage leads upward through the heart of the pyramid to the Grand Gallery, the most impressive space inside the structure. The Grand Gallery is a long, high corridor, about 153 feet long and 28 feet high, with a corbelled ceiling of polished limestone that narrows in 7 steps to a narrow slot at the top. The space is, even today, extraordinary. A soaring tunnel of stone, rising at a steep angle through the mass of the pyramid. At the top of the Grand Gallery, a low passage leads to the king's chamber, the burial chamber of the pharaoh. The room is relatively small, about 34 feet long, 17 feet wide, and 19 feet high. The walls and ceiling are made of red granite, brought from Aswan, 500 miles to the south. The ceiling is formed by 9 massive granite beams, each weighing between 25 and 80 tons. Above these beams are 5 relieving chambers. empty spaces designed to distribute the enormous weight of the stone above and prevent the ceiling from collapsing. In the center of the king's chamber stands a sarcophagus, a rectangular box of red granite, undecorated, unlidded, empty. It has been empty for thousands of years. Whatever was placed in it, the mummy of Khufu, his grave goods, his treasures, was removed long ago by tomb robbers whose names and dates we will never know. Why did they build it? The answer, for the Egyptians, was not complicated. They built the pyramids because the dead needed a home, because the afterlife was real, because the pharaoh was a god, and a god's home had to be worthy of his divinity. The Egyptian afterlife was not an abstract concept. It was, in the Egyptian imagination, a physical place, a parallel world, existing alongside the world of the living, separated by a boundary that the dead could cross. The afterlife looked, in many ways, like Egypt itself. There were fields to farm. There were rivers to fish. There were houses to live in. The dead continued in the next world, doing the things they had done in this one. But to reach the afterlife, the body had to be preserved. The Egyptians believed that the soul, or rather, the souls, for the Egyptians believed in multiple aspects of the soul, needed the body as a kind of anchor. If the body decayed, the soul might lose its way. If the body was destroyed, the soul might be lost forever. This is why the Egyptians developed mummification, the art of preserving the body after death. The process, by the time of the later kingdoms, had become an elaborate 70-day ritual. The embalmers first removed the internal organs, the lungs, the liver, the stomach, the intestines, through an incision in the left side of the body. These organs were preserved separately in 4 containers called canopic jars, each protected by a different god. The brain was extracted through the nose using a long bronze hook. The Egyptians did not consider the brain important. They believed that thinking happened in the heart. The body was then packed in natron, a natural salt found in the desert, and left for 40 days until all the moisture had been drawn out. The desiccated body was then washed, anointed with oils and resins, stuffed with linen and sawdust to restore its shape, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages. Amulets and charms were tucked between the layers of wrapping to protect the dead in the underworld. The wrapped mummy was placed in a wooden coffin, sometimes nested inside 2 or 3 coffins, each painted with the face of the dead and covered with protective spells. The coffin was placed in the tomb, surrounded by everything the dead would need: food, wine, clothing, furniture, tools, jewelry, games, and sometimes small figurines called shabtis, who would serve the dead as workers in the afterlife. The tomb was sealed. The prayers were spoken. The dead embarked on their journey. The journey itself, the Egyptians believed, was dangerous. The dead had to pass through gates guarded by demons. They had to navigate rivers of fire. They had to answer riddles posed by supernatural beings. They had to recite the correct spells, spells that were written in later centuries on papyrus scrolls and placed inside the coffin, forming what we now call the Book of the Dead. A dead man who knew the right words could pass through any gate. A dead man who did not might be lost forever in the darkness of the underworld. At the end of the journey, the dead stood before Osiris, the god of the underworld, and faced the final judgment. The heart of the dead, the organ the Egyptians believed contained the soul's true character, was weighed on a great scale against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was light, if the dead had lived a just life, a balanced life, a life in harmony with the cosmic order, the heart and the feather balanced, and the dead was admitted to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, to live forever in peace and abundance. If the heart was heavy, if the dead had lived a life of cruelty, of dishonesty, of chaos, the heart outweighed the feather, and a terrible creature called Amit, the devourer, who had the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, ate the heart. The dead ceased to exist, not death, but annihilation, the worst fate the Egyptian imagination could conceive. The pyramid, above it all, stood watch. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was not alone on the Giza plateau. Khufu's son, or possibly grandson, Khafre, who ruled from around 2558 to 2532 before Christ, built the second pyramid at Giza. It is slightly smaller than Khufu's, about 448 feet high, but it appears from certain angles to be taller because it was built on higher ground. It still retains at its apex a cap of the original white limestone casing that once covered all three pyramids. When the sun catches this cap in the late afternoon, it glows against the sky, a reminder of what all three pyramids once looked like when they were new, smooth, white, shining, perfect. Khafre also built, or is traditionally credited with building, the most mysterious monument on the Giza plateau, the Great Sphinx. The Sphinx is carved from a single ridge of natural limestone, left standing when the surrounding stone was quarried for Khafre's pyramid and its associated temples. It is 240 feet long and 66 feet high. It has the body of a lion and the head of a man, traditionally identified as Khafre himself, wearing the royal headdress. The Sphinx faces east toward the rising sun. It guards the entrance to Khafre's mortuary complex. It has, for nearly 5,000 years, gazed across the Nile Valley with an expression that visitors have variously described as serene, knowing, inscrutable, and slightly sad. It is one of the most recognizable images in the world. It is also one of the most damaged. The nose is missing, knocked off, according to one tradition, by Napoleon's soldiers, though this story is almost certainly untrue. The nose was already missing when Napoleon arrived, centuries earlier. The body is eroded. The limestone is soft, and 5,000 years of wind and sand have worn it smooth in places. The Sphinx has no inscription. It has no internal chambers. It has no grave goods. It is, as far as we can tell, purely a monument, a statement of royal power, carved from the living rock of the plateau, designed to watch over the dead pharaoh forever. Over the centuries, the Sphinx has been buried repeatedly in sand. The desert, encroaching from the west, has covered it to its shoulders, to its neck, to its chin. The ancient pharaohs themselves cleared the sand more than once. A granite stele, the dream stele, placed between the Sphinx's paws by the pharaoh Thutmose IV, around 1400 before Christ, records how the young prince fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx and dreamed that the monument spoke to him, promising him the throne if he would clear the sand from its body. Thutmose cleared the sand. He became pharaoh. Whether the dream was real or a useful political story, we will never know. The Romans cleared the sand. The Arabs let it return. Napoleon's soldiers found the Sphinx buried to its shoulders. The final complete excavation was not finished until 1936. less than a century ago. For most of its existence, the Sphinx has been at least partially underground. The third pyramid at Giza was built by Menkaure, Khafra's successor. It is the smallest of the three, only about 215 feet high. It is made in part of red granite rather than limestone. It was, by the standards of the Giza pyramids, modest. After Menkaure, the age of the Great Pyramids was essentially over. Later pharaohs continued to build pyramids, but they were smaller, less precisely constructed, and made of cheaper materials. The pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties at Saqqara and other sites are often little more than rubble cores with limestone casings, many of which have collapsed. The engineering knowledge, the organizational capacity, and perhaps the economic surplus that had made the Great Pyramids possible seem to have declined. By the end of the Old Kingdom, around 2100 before Christ, the centralized state that had built the pyramids had itself collapsed. Egypt entered a period of political fragmentation, the so-called First Intermediate Period, in which rival rulers fought over the diminished kingdom and the great building projects ceased entirely. The pyramids at Giza, by that time, were already ancient. They had been standing for 500 years. The white limestone casing was still intact. The mortuary temples were still maintained, but the era that had produced them was gone, and nothing like it would come again. When Egypt recovered, when the Middle Kingdom and then the New Kingdom arose, and new pharaohs built new monuments, the pyramids were already relics of a distant past. The New Kingdom pharaohs, 1,000 years after Khufu, chose to be buried not in pyramids, but in the Valley of the Kings, in hidden tombs cut into the cliffs of western Thebes. They had learned, perhaps, that pyramids, however grand, could not keep the tomb robbers out. The Great Pyramid had been robbed. When exactly we do not know, but by the time of the New Kingdom it was already empty. The pharaoh's body was gone. His treasures were gone. The sarcophagus in the king's chamber sat open and bare. The pyramid had been built to protect the pharaoh for eternity. It had failed in that specific purpose, but it had succeeded in another. The pharaoh's name was remembered. His monument still stood. The pyramids have been visited by travelers for as long as there have been travelers. The ancient Greeks came. Herodotus, the great historian, visited around 450 before Christ, more than 2,000 years after the pyramids were built. He was told by his Egyptian guides that the Great Pyramid had taken 100,000 men 20 years to build. He was told that the pharaoh Khufu had been a cruel tyrant who had closed the temples and forced his people into labor. He was told, and he recorded with a hint of skepticism, that Khufu had even prostituted his own daughter to raise money for the construction. These stories were almost certainly false. They reflected not the reality of Khufu's reign, which was 2,000 years in the past and barely remembered, but the attitudes of the Egyptian priests who served as Herodotus's guides, men who had their own reasons for presenting the pyramid builders in a negative light. The Romans came. Julius Caesar visited Egypt. Augustus visited Egypt. Roman tourists carved their names into the stones of the pyramids and the Sphinx, graffiti that can still be read today, scratched into the ancient surface by men who lived 2,000 years ago and who themselves stood, astonished, before a monument that was already 2,000 years old when they arrived. The medieval Arab scholars came. They measured the pyramids with considerable accuracy. They recorded the local legends. In 820, the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun, frustrated by the absence of a visible entrance, ordered his workers to tunnel into the north face of the Great Pyramid by brute force. They hacked through the limestone with hammers and chisels and fire, heating the stone and then dousing it with vinegar to crack it. After months of work, they broke through into the internal passages. They found the king's chamber. They found the sarcophagus. It was empty. Whatever treasure had been placed inside the pyramid, gold, jewels, the mummy of the pharaoh, had been removed long before. The tomb robbers had beaten the caliph by centuries, perhaps by millennia. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt with an army and a team of scholars. Napoleon's scientists measured the pyramids, surveyed the Sphinx, and catalogued the monuments with systematic precision. Their work, published as the Description de l'Égypte, introduced the pyramids to the modern European imagination and launched the age of scientific Egyptology. The pyramids had become by then what they remain today: the most visited, most photographed, most written about monuments on Earth. The pyramids at Giza are still there. They stand on the western edge of modern Cairo, a city of 22 million people that has grown over the past century to the very feet of the Sphinx. The desert that once separated the pyramids from the Nile Valley has been built over. Apartment blocks crowd the eastern approach. The juxtaposition, the ancient and the modern, the sacred and the commercial, the eternal and the disposable, is one of the strangest sights in the world. But the pyramids themselves are unchanged. Or rather, they have changed only in the ways that 4,500 years of weather can change a mountain of stone. They are shorter than they were. The Great Pyramid has lost about 30 feet from its apex, the capstone long since fallen or removed. They are rougher than they were. The smooth casing is gone, leaving the stepped, blocky profile that we now consider iconic, but that would have been unrecognizable to Khufu. You can enter the Great Pyramid. There is a ticket office. There is a wooden staircase built inside the ancient passage. You climb, bent double in the low corridor, up the ascending passage and into the grand gallery. The air is close. The stone presses in on all sides. You climb the gallery, 153 feet of polished limestone, and you emerge, finally, in the king's chamber. The room is quiet. The granite walls are bare. The sarcophagus sits in the center, empty, as it has been empty for thousands of years. You can reach into it. You can touch the stone that was carved 4,500 years ago to hold the body of a god. Outside in the evening, the sound and light show projects colored beams onto the faces of the pyramids and the Sphinx. Tourists take photographs. The call to prayer rises from the mosques of Cairo, and the lights of the city glow orange against the eastern sky. The pyramids above it all are dark. They catch no light. They reflect nothing. They sit as they have always sat, on the edge of the desert, facing the rising sun, waiting. They have been waiting for 4,500 years. They will be waiting, almost certainly, for 4,500 more. It is late now. Close your eyes. Let the pharaohs rest in the tombs that could not protect them, in the chambers that were emptied long before anyone alive today was born. Let Khufu rest, whose body has never been found, whose face we do not know, whose only surviving image is a tiny ivory figurine, 3 inches tall, found in a temple far from Giza. the builder of the largest structure of the ancient world, remembered now by a statue that fits in the palm of your hand. Let Imhotep rest, the architect who stacked stone upon stone and invented a form that would outlast his civilization. Let Sneferu rest, who built 3 pyramids and got the angles wrong, and then got them right, and gave his son the knowledge to build a wonder. Let the workers rest, who carried the stone and pulled the sledges and slept in the barracks, and ate the bread and drank the beer, and were buried at the end in the shadow of the monument they built. Their names are mostly lost. Their graffiti survives, hidden inside the stones. Friends of Khufu, drunkards of Menkaure, the quiet jokes of men who labored 4,500 years ago under a sun that has not changed. Let the Sphinx rest, gazing east across the valley, watching the sun rise as it has risen 10,000 times since the stone was carved. Its nose is gone. Its paint is gone. Its secrets, if it has secrets, have been kept. Let the Nile rest, the great brown river that made it all possible, the mud, the flood, the surplus, the civilization, the pyramids. The river is dammed now at Aswan. The floods no longer come. The black silt no longer settles on the fields. But the river still flows, as it has flowed for millions of years, through the narrow green valley, through the vast surrounding desert, toward the sea. Let all of it, the stone and the sand and the river and the dead, let all of it finally rest. Let the long dream of the pyramids drift away.